Welcome to SCL, the Subject, Composition and Light Photography Podcast. Hello and welcome to SCL, the Subject and Composition Podcast. You can tell it's a Monday morning and I'm a little bit slow today. Okay, my name's Rob from robnunphoto.com. And this is a podcast all about sort of my experiences in learning how to become a better photographer and hopefully sharing those ideas and techniques with everybody else. So please feel free to check out www.robnunphoto.com. That's ROBNUNNPHOTO.com for the various posts and things. And for the podcast, I always post the links on the website as well, the blog, so you can go through and click through rather than having to write down all the complicated links. We've also got a group on Flickr. If you just search the groups for robnunphoto.com. Just search the groups for robnunphoto, and there's a nice little discussion on there and a nice little photo pool. So please join, make some comments, submit some photos, and just have some fun with it. The format of the podcast is normally a little bit of news about what I've been doing, and then a subject that I'll go into a little bit more detail about. And today that's going to be how to take sharper photographs, or sometimes people refer to them as trying to get tack sharp photographs. So hopefully that will give you a few ideas on doing that if you think that your photography could benefit from having photographs that are a little bit less blurred. Okay, so what have I been doing in the last week or so? Actually, I'll tell you what first. Let's talk about the photo assignment on the Flickr group Time, because there's been some great new submissions on the thread we've got going there. Weedjam has put in some really nice ideas. He's done a really nice picture of a clock, and there's also a really cool blurred shot he's taken. I think it's from inside a subway train as it's going, and he's sort of pulling together all the ideas of, the blur of the movement, and yet these people are sort of frozen in time inside the train. And what I thought was really interesting about it as well was the interaction, or the lack of interaction, between all these separate people that are in quite a confined space, but there's no eye contact between them. They're all in their own little time zones, if you like, which is really cool. And he also did a really interesting, really funny one as well, where he's played around with perspective, so it looks like his fingers trying to move the hands on a clock, like in a clock tower. That was a really cool idea. And Josie as well, she's submitted some nice ones, a nice macro shot of I think it's a music box, she says, and she's done this great picture of, I think it's like a self-portrait, but she's used a long exposure, so she's sort of blurred it, and it's a really scary picture to look at. You look at it and you think, "Oh God, what's this?" It's sort of really striking. So well done. And if you haven't submitted a picture, we've got until the end of the month. Just anything to do with time, anything that pops into your mind, just shoot some pictures and submit them. Remember, it's all about fun and just practicing. Nobody's going to criticise anybody for the pictures they take. It's about participating and getting out and taking pictures with your camera. I still haven't submitted my last photo because what I want is a nice blurred picture. But I've done some traffic, but because I've had to take them during the day, they're not that good. So I don't know. I might put them up. But I don't know, I really want to go out at night, but as I've got kids and a family, it's difficult to get out late at night and take pictures because I've got other commitments. Alright, so what other things have I been doing this week? Well, all the posts are up on robnunphoto.com, but since the last podcast I've really been looking at I've been playing around with Noise Ninja. So if you think that you could do with having a little bit of noise reduction in your photographs, and noise, we're talking about digital noise here. So with digital cameras, inherently they produce noise, or tiny little speckles of various colour on the images, because of the randomness of the way that the light hits the receptors on the sensor. And the way you can control noise is by using a low ISO setting on your camera. So the ISO, so if you do that because because it's a little bit dark that day, and you want to use a sort of faster shutter speed, you have to increase the ISO, and the level of noise increases. You can't really see noise unless you're zoomed in to sort of 100%. But you.
Database has been updated.
Hello, my computer's just said something. The antivirus has just updated itself. Thank you very much, Avast antivirus. But going back to noise, you can also apply software to do it for you. And one I've been using is Noise Ninja. And there's a post on the site about how Noise Ninja does this and the effect it has on your photographs. And it's quite cool. It's quite expensive to buy. I think it's about $60, and it comes as a plug-in for Photoshop or a standalone application, but it does the job. It works. So if you're thinking about, you've already got Elements or Photoshop, or you use maybe another photo editing program, and you think, right, I really want to tackle noise. Noise Ninja is definitely one of the best. And I've actually created some profiles, the S5700 or S700 as it's known in the States. So when I've got time, I'll post them on the site as well. So if you've got one of those Fujis, you can download the profile and it can apply them automatically. One of the other things I was thinking about this week was photo backup and archiving, and how fragile the digital media is. Mainly because I've lost a couple of hard drives in the last couple of months, and I've lost, have I lost the photo? Well, I haven't really lost the photos. They're still on the hard drives, but the hard drives need fixing. So there was a few photos on there that I hadn't backed up, so I'm a little bit, not gutted because I can retake them, but I would hate for the same thing to happen again now when I've got a lot more photographs. And so for the past couple of months I've been using a sort of more advanced backup strategy, which basically means that I'm not happy unless my images, my photographs, are in 3 places. So what I do is I store them on my hard drive, I burn them to CD-ROMs or DVD-Rs, and I also upload them to Flickr. And I put them sort of in private sets so that nobody else can see them, because they're just backups. And so the good thing about using Flickr for that is if you've got a pro account, you can upload as many photographs as you want. So I've got like thousands and thousands of backup photos, and basically what I do is when I get in from shooting with my camera, first thing I do is copy the pictures off the SD card onto my hard drive. Then I straight away check that they've copied over okay onto the computer, and then I burn them to a CDR, and then I upload all of them to Flickr so it's all safe. And at that point, when I'm happy that it's on those 3 places, I can then format the card in the camera again so that I can sort of shoot some more pictures or put a different SD card in. And it's definitely worth thinking about, because there's nothing worse than turning your PC on and for it to go disk IO error, and then you've got all the hassle of trying to fix it, or maybe that you've lost them. There is a slight problem with my technique, though, in fact, that using Flickr as your online storage, your off-site storage, if you like, so that you've got a backup in case your house burns down, is the fact that you can only really do it with JPEGs. They don't support RAW. So if you're looking at RAW, you'd have to look at a different online backup system, maybe someone like Mozy, where they back up everything on your computer. You might have noticed, if you've been looking at my photo stream, that I've also done some still lifes this week. Mainly because it's been raining so much, so I was like, what am I going to do? And I got a book from the library about painting still lifes, the history of it, and sort of shots from the Renaissance, medieval period right up to modern days. And it really got me thinking about making photographs like this. So I had to play around, and what it does is it makes you think about composition a little bit more. And meaning as well, because often with the sort of Renaissance paintings, there's a lot of meaning behind the picture, the painting, a story, if you like, to tell. and it makes you think about how you can apply that in your photographs as well. So I did one called the Five Senses, because a traditional subject for still lifes is the five senses, but I tried to put a bit of a modern twist on it by using HDR. But I mean, you don't have to do that, but then thinking about, if a Renaissance painter was around today and he had to produce a painting of the five senses, what things might he put in there? So I sort of combined the traditional things like fruit for taste and flowers for smell, but then I put things in like my iPod and an old digital camera for hearing and seeing. So, it got me thinking about it. And it also really got me thinking about a bit more about light, because I was taking these pictures on my kitchen workbench with the camera on a tripod, and it was difficult to stop the reflections in certain things. So, I didn't want the highlights to blow out on the shiny camera, for example, so I was like having to draw the curtains in the kitchen. A little bit later on in the week, when I took some pictures of some macro objects on a black background, a couple of things were really shiny. There was a couple of like stone ornaments that were basically, if you look at the pictures on my photo stream, you can see the reflections of the windows in the kitchen, even though the curtains were drawn. And that really got me thinking about how important it is to control light in that situation by diffusing it by using covers over the curtains, or some sort of diffuser around the subject, or making one of those little light boxes to display them on. So I started to realise, I guess, how important and helpful having a sort of tiny little studio setup could be, rather than just taking everything in natural light. I also got my old Kodak point and shoot out, my old CX-4230 bits I got about 5 years ago, because I was thinking about, there's a lot of emphasis on expensive cameras and lots of megapixels and the latest thing. But I was wondering, even with an old point and shoot that's got a resolution of about 2 megapixels, could I, take a decent picture with it? And could I take a HDR picture with it? And I went down to Gosport, and I think it did really well. I mean, it's not like I'm going to replace my S5700 and start using an older camera again, but it really emphasises the point that it's not about the camera. It's about the techniques you use. It's about the subjects you choose. It's about how you look at the light and the time of day you take the picture, which I think is really important. And then I did, at the same time as that, I did a mini photo walk, and I discovered a new place in Gosport. I'd seen the outside of it loads, but I didn't know you could go inside. A place called the Gosport Bastion, and basically Gosport is next to the harbour, and the harbours are between Gosport and Portsmouth. And so you might have seen my other pictures of the forts that sort of are further out, sort of protecting Gosport, or would have done during the 19th century. But originally Gosport was surrounded by the town right next to the harbour was a walled town, and part of that is still left, where there's a bit of a moat and there's all these earthworks. But when I parked my car to go down and take some pictures of the marina, I noticed that there was this big wooden gate that was open, and there was a sign on the outside saying Gosport Bastion open during the summer from 9 o'clock till 6 o'clock. Please take a look around. And it was empty. Just walked in. It's not very big, but there were some interesting old gun emplacements, no guns though, and brickwork, and it was quite an atmospheric place as well. So that was okay. What else have I been doing? Oh yeah, if you're interested in HDR, I want to try a different piece of software that's free. Picturenaut. I downloaded their software as well, and done a little comparison post between Picturenaut and Photomatics, and I was quite pleased actually with Picturenaut, although it didn't really deal with handheld HDRs very well because of it couldn't really align them properly. For the others, for the tripod ones, I thought it was really good and produced images that were on a par with Photomatics ones, but different as well. Picturenaut uses global settings when it's working out how to do it, where Photomatics use local ones, I think. And the Picturenaut tended to produce slightly more natural looking HDR, so I'm going to be playing around with that a lot in the next few weeks. And I just thought of a way to get around the fact that it can't align very properly. What I'll do is I'll align the pictures first in Photoshop, then save them, then put them into Picturenaut. But it's free. It's definitely worth looking at, and there's links on the site to go and download it. I went on a little photo walk yesterday as well, and I took some pics. I actually got some pictures of deer. Well, one deer, which was really cool. Some wildlife in Gosport, but I haven't put that up on the blog yet. I'll be doing that a little bit later this week. Okay, so what's our main subject to today? Well, taking sharper photographs, or tack sharp photographs. Because I don't know about you, but there's nothing more frustrating than when you're taking pictures and you're looking at them on the review on the LCD screen on the back of your camera, and you think, oh yeah, they're really sharp, they look really cool. And then you get home and you excuse me, you look at them on the big computer screen and they're out of focus or blurred, and you're like, oh great. So what I wanted to talk about is how we can address these issues and maybe apply some techniques for avoiding them. And the main causes really of not having sharp photographs are things like camera shake, your subject shaking, your choice of aperture and focal length, so how much you're zoomed in, whether you're actually focused properly in the first place, and what sort of post-processing you apply to the photographs. So let's start off with the basics. So you're going to take a picture. First thing you need to think about is camera shake. So we need to make sure that our camera is on a really solid base. And the best choice, obviously, is using something like a tripod, because you screw the camera onto the tripod, you set the legs up so it's nice and solid, and make sure it's nice and level, and you're making sure that the camera will be good. So it's pretty much essential if you want to take really tack sharp photographs. I mean, I've just got a really cheap one from Asda that cost me about £6. I would say probably my next upgrade in terms of kit will be a better tripod, because I want one with a quick release plate. So you have a plate that you screw onto the bottom of the camera, and then you can just click it onto the tripod. So the process of taking the camera on and off the tripod is really easy. And I also want one that will level a lot better as well, because with the cheaper tripods, especially when you flick the camera into portrait mode, so it's on its side, it can be really difficult to figure out what's level. So I want one with a couple of those little bubble levels on as well. But you don't have to use a tripod. And well, one more thing about tripods as well. Even if the wind's really strong, even a tripod will wobble as well. You'll get movement that way. So one of the other techniques I use is, quite often I like to get quite low on the ground. So I have a little woolen hat that I keep in my bag, and I can rest my camera on that. But you can buy bean bags and sort of mini tripods like the Gorilla Pods to do a similar sort of thing. If you can't support your camera though, and holding is the only way of doing it, we've got to think about how we're going to brace ourselves to make ourselves like solid, like a tripod. So maybe try leaning against a wall or a tree, anything really to stop your body swaying, and then really think about how you're holding the camera. Do you hold the camera with your elbows sticking out to either side? Because if you do, maybe you're better off tucking in your arms and bracing the arm that you use to hold the camera, bracing it against your chest or your tummy, so that you're holding it steady. Don't squeeze the camera when you're about to take a shot. Just gently support it. If you want a really steady shot as well, make sure you use the shutter delay button. So flick it onto like 2 seconds or 5 seconds, and that way, when you press the shutter, the camera will delay before it takes the shot, so you're avoiding any movements of you pressing the shutter. Another technique I use, especially if I'm not going to use the shutter delay, is to take a deep breath before you take the shot. So you sort of breathe in, and then as you're taking the shot, you breathe out, and about halfway through you then press the shutter. And that, by breathing out, you're relaxing as you take the shutter, so you're less likely to jerk. And obviously, you can put your camera in something like continuous shooting mode as well, or top 3 shooting mode, so that when you're taking a picture, it's going click, 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 and it's taking a number of exposures. So the chances of you getting one that's sharp is a lot more, because you'll have a couple that are blurred and a couple that aren't, and you throw them away. Okay, subject movement. So, we've put our camera on a tripod, for example, on its beanbag, and it's solid. But now we didn't need to think about any potential movements in our subjects. Maybe it's a person, or a landscape, or an animal, or a tree. And also we need to think about this if we're hand holding as well, because you'd be surprised how much movement there are in things, especially when you're outside, especially with things like the wind, with grass just gently swaying, that you don't always notice. Flags flapping in the background, things like that, or birds flying across. Essentially what we need to try and do is freeze time, and the way that we can do this is by having a faster shutter speed. Now these things we're going to talk about now, you can't normally do them in the auto mode in your camera. You'll want to go to the program mode, aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual modes, but probably the best ones to play around to start off with is either program mode or aperture priority mode. These are what we call auto exposure settings. So when you change the aperture, the camera will change the shutter speed, or if you change the shutter speed, the camera will change the aperture. And if you're using program mode as well, I know on my camera you can then set the ISO to auto. So in order to freeze the subject, we need to use a fast shutter speed, so you're looking at 1/100th, 1/250th of a second, etc. But the problem we have is as we're increasing the speed, we're going to be letting a lot less light in the camera, so our pictures could be underexposed, they could be a bit dark. So what we need to do then is increase the aperture size, so we make the f-stop number smaller, so the hole gets bigger. So you go down to something like f3.5, or we need to increase how sensitive the camera is to light, so we increase the ISO setting. So if you use a really high ISO like 400, 800, 1600, the shutter speed can be really fast, so you'll freeze that blowing grass in the wind, or that animal, or that person. But the problem is, as we talked about a little bit earlier, is that you get more noise at higher ISO settings, so it's not an ideal situation. Another the way I tend to do it is I'll choose my aperture first, so I'll just open up the aperture. If I think there's going to be a problem with camera shake, I'll open up the aperture to its widest setting on my camera, which is f3.5. See what setting the camera comes up with, because I'll be in aperture priority mode. Look for the little warning that will come up on the screen, maybe a little flashing, I think it's a little yellow flashing camera on the Fujifilm. And then if I think that's going to be a problem, I'll increase the ISO. But remember, if you're on a tripod, all you're thinking about then is the shutter speed, because you're not worried about the camera shaking. And then I'll increase the ISO, and as you increase the ISO, you'll see the shutter speed start to increase as well. If you're hand holding the camera as well, bear in mind that zoom affects how much movement you'll get as well. So as you zoom in further, what happens is any movement in your camera is being magnified. So if you, like I was taking a picture of this deer, I think it was yesterday, and when I was zoomed in at full focal length, I was zoomed in at 10 times. I was trying to stand as still as I could, but even in the viewfinder I could see that the screen bobbing up and down. So in that case, I wanted the shot, so I think I pumped up the ISO to 800 and then 1600 because we were in some woods to try and get it sharp, and even then it wasn't incredibly sharp. What I should have done is, if I'd thought about it, I should have had my tripod set up, popped my tripod down, and then I wouldn't have had to worry about that. The other thing you can also do is, remember, you've got the flash. Use flash. Will freeze somebody in a portrait. Okay, it might not be that flattering, but if you need to get the shot, use flash. Or if it's a windy day, you can always wait around for the wind to die down. Take a number of shots again, so you might have a chance of one that isn't blurred, or you can take the artistic choice to have things blurred. So if you're taking a picture of a landscape and the grass is blowing all over the place, use a longer shutter speed so that it does appear blurred in the photograph, but then have other stuff that's sharp. Imagine a picture of, say, Stonehenge. So there's Stonehenge, and there's all this grass that's waving around in the foreground. Well, the stones aren't going to move, so you could have a really nice artistic picture with the grass nice and blurred and the stones tack sharp, because they haven't moved. And with all of these things, take lots of shots. The more pictures you take, the better. The more you're making your own photographer's luck, the chances of coming up with a great picture. And obviously, the golden rule is use a tripod. aperture and focal length choice. Now, it's getting a bit technical here, but I mean, you go into it further if you want to do a search on Google for finding out the sharpest aperture for your camera. But the gist of it is that at different apertures and different focal lengths, so how far you're zoomed in, the optical sharpness of the lens changes. So what I'm saying is, if you take a picture at f3.5 and take a picture of the same subject at f13.5, 13.6, whatever it is, if you look really, really closely, there'll be a difference in sharpness, independent of focusing and movement and blur and all that sort of stuff. Optically, the picture will be different, and this is to do with things like diffraction and the way that the light comes through the camera. The general accepted wisdom is that lenses tend to be sharpest around their middle aperture, so f6.8 or I think it's 6.2 on the S5700, and the sort of middle focal length as well. Because not only does it affect the aperture, it depends how far zoomed in or not zoomed in you are. So yeah, I mean you can play around with this. It really applies more to guys using DSLRs, I think, rather than bridge cameras, where you would work out what is the best, sharpest setting for each individual lenses, so that you can then choose to have them. When you're using a bridge camera, I mean, I don't worry about it at all, to be honest. You know, I just shoot what I think will give me the best, sharpest picture, but not in terms of which aperture I'm using. In terms of this particular bit, what I do think about is depth of field. So what we're saying about here is, depending which aperture you choose, that makes, well, it's sort of, when you choose a different aperture, you'll get a different amount of your subject in focus in terms of distance from the lens. So if you're using a small aperture, say f3.5, the amount of the picture in focus will be less. You'll have a smaller depth of field. So if you're taking a picture of, say, a portrait of a person where you want the background to be out of focus to give a nice background, you would use a small aperture, f3.5, a big aperture, sorry, f3.5. Whereas if you're taking a landscape where you want everything to be in focus, you'd use a high aperture, say f3 at 13.5 or below. But it's a trade-off, especially with the smaller apertures with the higher f numbers, because as you're increasing that f number and the aperture is getting smaller, although your depth of field is increasing, so more things are in focus, you're really in danger of getting motion blur, because the camera's having to use a longer shutter speed. Okay, so then you'd have to increase the ISO to keep it down, but then you've got the problem of noise. So it's a bit of a balancing act, to be honest. You know, you've got to play around, and this is why it's really important to take shots of your subject at different settings, so that when you get home and you can see them on your big computer screen, you can see what's worked the best. Another thing we're thinking about with depth of field, though, and why you shouldn't get too bothered about it in general sort of photography, is at some point when you're focusing on things further and further away, the lens will go hyperfocal, or it will start to focus to infinity, so everything beyond that point will then be in focus. So think about your depth of field. You know, if you're taking a macro picture, and you think we're talking about focusing and what's sharp, well, if you're using a large aperture, f3.5, not the whole of the flower will be in focus, so you'd have to, tighten down the aperture, use a higher f number, and more of the flower will be in focus, unless you've made the artistic decision that you don't want it all in focus. But these are just things to think about in the background. Right, so we've got our camera nice and solid, we've selected our aperture. So what other reasons might your pictures still be a little bit out of focus or soft? And what I'm doing is I'm assuming you're using the autofocus features of your camera. Well, the first thing is to try and understand really how most non-DSLRs work in terms of focusing. How does the autofocus work? Well, what it does is it looks for contrast between objects, and then what it does, it uses its little computer inside it to change the focus to see if it can increase the focus, increase the contrast, and decrease it. And then when it gets to the point where the contrast between objects is at its maximum, it then thinks it's in focus, which is great. However, some things don't have much contrast, so things like clouds or fuzzy things, or sometimes they have trouble with metallic and reflective objects because it can't ascertain the focus. So in that case, you can either take the plunge and go to manual focusing, which is really difficult unless you've got an optical viewfinder, or you can use something called focus locking. So what this is, if you've got two objects that you want to take a picture of, and you're trying to focus on one and it won't focus on it, focus on the other one, press the shutter halfway down, so you've locked the focus, and then turn the camera and take a picture of the other one. Another technique I use quite a lot is, especially if you're zooming, you zoom in and you try and focus and it go meh, meh, and it won't focus. Zoom out a bit, try and focus a little bit, and if it does, zoom in a little bit more and try and refocus, and that can work quite a lot. The other problem that cameras that using contrast to autofocus have trouble with is often in low light as well, so if things are getting a bit dim. So that's why your camera has a little helper light on it. On the Fuji, it's a little orange light, and so what that is, that lights up the subject. So the first thing is make sure you're not blocking that light with your finger, or if you're using like a coking system, like with my camera that I've got a coking on the end, at certain angles the filters block that helper light, so so I have to take it off. And in that case, you'd go to manual focusing, or you'd use a flash or something like that. And another thing to remember as well is that your camera can only, especially if you're taking shots that are quite close, it can only focus up to a certain distance away, after that distance. So sometimes it's, switch to macro mode, even for subjects that that are with 4, 5, 6 feet away. Switch to the macro mode, see if that's better. Obviously when you get really close, you're going to be using macro, and then switch to super macro if you've got it as well. Another thing to do with focusing, especially if your camera's on a tripod and the subject you're trying to take a picture of is off center, have a read through your manual of the camera and have a look at the autofocus settings. Now these settings are normally only available in program mode, aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual modes, and they tend to be something like center, multi, and area autofocusing modes. So what do these mean? Well, with center autofocusing, the camera is just looking in the middle of the frame, looking at the contrast, and it will focus on that. Now with multi, what happens is the camera hunts around the middle of the frame, and it will find the object that's got the most contrast, and it will focus on that. So if you're trying to line up a nice rule of thirds shot, you could use multi. The only problem with using multi is that the camera is choosing what to focus on. So if there's more than one object that's got a lot of contrast in the scene, you don't know which one it's going to focus on until it has, and the little brackets tell you. One of the most useful one is area. Now if you put your camera into area focus mode, you can actually move the cursor around the LCD screen and choose which area you want to focus it on, and that's really cool if the camera's on a tripod, say, and you're taking, I don't know, like a macro of a flower, and the flower's off to one side of the picture. You can play around and get it to focus on exactly what you want to play around with. The things you've got to watch out for though when you're using things like multi and area focusing is how the camera's setting the exposure, because often even though you're focusing on something that isn't in the center, the camera will still work out the exposure for the shot from looking at the center if you're using sort of spot photometry. So in that case where we're taking a picture of a flower that's off center, what we might want to do then is go to manual mode and set the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO from pointing the camera at the flower, and then fix the camera and focus on the flower differently, and then we know we're going to get the exposure that we want. And sometimes in various modes you can only use center focusing. So I think like in macro mode on the S5700, in macro mode it'll only focus in the middle of the picture in multi mode. So the most important thing with these things is play around with them, know how to use them. So if you're in a situation where you think, oh god, I wish the camera would focus on that building off to the right, you know how to do it, and you can press the menu buttons and go for it. Another in-camera trick as well with focus, it's sort of related to focus, is how much sharpening the camera applies to the pictures. If you go through the menus, you'll see if your camera's saving as JPEGs, you can change the amount. So if you're taking pictures of hard-ed objects like man-made things, so buildings, cars, equipment, etc., you could increase the sharpness to get those edges a bit better. But if you're just taking pictures of natural objects, so people, animals, landscapes, you probably want to stick with normal sharpening so you don't get any unnatural sort of artifacts or edges appearing. So we've taken our picture. The final step is obviously we've used the shutter delay button or a remote shutter to make sure we haven't shoved the camera when we press the button. We've got home and we're looking at our pictures and we think, we're going to do some post-processing now with some photo software. Now, when you're ever going to working at photographs, especially when you're thinking about sharpening, it's really important that you're zoomed in to 100%. So, 1 pixel on your camera is 1 pixel on the screen, because then you're getting the best view. If you're trying to do it by zoom, you're zoomed out more, the picture will probably seem sharper than it really is, and you won't get, when you apply sharpening, you could apply too much or too little because you don't see it. So the first thing to do is always zoom into 100%, and just be careful about how much sharpening you apply. I've been really guilty in the past of applying way too much sharpening to loads of my images, and it really ruins them. They tend to look okay when they're small, but when you look at them big, they look, you can see the lines where I've applied unsharp mask and things, and you get lots of if you've got any speckles in the picture, sharpening tends to bring them out as well, and it doesn't look very pretty. So the first thing to remember is be careful with it. And you can apply sharpening using Photoshop Elements, Photoshop. Picasso can do it. Picnic, the editor on Flickr, can do it as well. But just treat it with a grain of salt and make sure that you never apply the sharpening to your original images. So part of your workflow should always be your original photographs that you took in the camera. You never touch. When you're going to work on them, you always work on a copy. Because if you're working with JPEGs like I do, because that's all my camera takes. Every time you open a JPEG and then save it, the computer's compressing it a bit, so you're losing detail and you're adding artifacts. And if I open that edited one and save it again, it gets worse and worse and worse. Every time you open and close a JPEG, it's going to get worse. So what you want to do is never work on your originals. And if you do work on pictures and you think you might want to do some more editing afterwards, try and save them in a lossless format that doesn't compress them. So if you're using, I think most photo editing programs can normally save them in PSD, the Photoshop format. Elements does it, Photoshop does it, and I'm pretty sure PaintShop and all them lot will be able to save it as a PSD. So it's not applying any compression at all. So you're safe to open up that file. And then when you want to produce an image that you want to share, whether it be on Flickr or somewhere else, then save it as a JPEG and then upload it. And also bear in mind that the amount of sharpening you apply to a picture depends on how you're going to show the picture. So if you're showing something on a computer screen like on Flickr, you don't have to apply that much sharpening. But if you're blowing something up and showing it on paper, printing it out, you might need quite a bit more sharpening. So just be careful. It's best I think it's best to have a slightly softer image than one that's been over sharpened. The technique I use is I tend to use a high pass filter in Photoshop Elements or Photoshop, the full Photoshop, and it's dead easy. All you do is you have your picture, you duplicate the layer, so you end up with 2 layers the same in your layers palette. Then you just go to Filter, High Pass, set the setting between 1.8 and 3, and then you change the blend mode to overlay. And then you can use a mask if you like to mask off the areas of sharpening that you don't want to. Because obviously the problem with applying global sharpening is that say it's a portrait, often the bits you want to sharpen are things like the eyes, but you don't want, and maybe I suppose the hair you might want to sharpen, but you don't want to sharpen the skin because you don't want the skin to be nice and soft and diffuse. So global editors aren't as good at it. You really want to use something that can do local editing like Elements or Photoshop or the GIMP or something like that. So we covered a lot here when we're talking about taking sharper pictures, taking tack sharp images. So what I'm going to do is the sort of little script I've used for this bit, I'm going to put in the podcast notes. I know I normally only leave the links in the podcast notes, but I'll leave all this writing in as well. So if you want to go over it again, or maybe read it while I'm going through it, then you can do that. And hopefully it's been a little bit helpful, and it will get you thinking about how to achieve sharper photographs the next time you go out. Okay, so recommendations for this week. First one, podcast recommendation is the Photography Podcast from Marco Kulik. You can get it at www.photography.ca, so it's a Canadian site, and I like his podcast because it's mainly based around answering readers' questions or listeners' questions, and they're quite short podcasts as well, unlike this one today. They tend to be sort of between 10 minutes and half an hour long. And he's got a real bubbly personality, and after you've listened to it, you always really want to go out and take lots of photographs. So check out the site, and they tend to have a lot of fine art photography on there, and check out and listen to the podcast. Recommended sites, who should we have this week? Moose Peterson's blog at www.moosenewsblog.com. That's MOOSENEWSBLOG.com. He's a nature and landscape photographer, and at the moment he's got these amazing pictures of brown bears they're taking pictures of up in I think it's Alaska, and these things are huge, 9 foot tall, these things, and they're so close, taking these pictures of them in the rivers eating all the salmon. Beautiful pictures, and if you dig a bit deeper and have a look at some of his landscapes, fantastic pictures, really inspirational, makes you want to go out and take some pictures. Our recommended Flickr photo stream this week is a chap called Tennessee Gator, and if you go to www.flickr.com/photos/ALGENGLER, you can have a look at his photo stream, and its specific set, which I'll put a link to in the podcast notes, is called The Sky, Moon and Stars, and he's got some beautiful landscape pictures of trees, the sun, the moon, the stars, funnily enough. Really, really nice. Some black and white, some colours. You look at them, his clouds as well look very good. Definitely worth adding this chap to your contacts list, so as he posts new pictures, you can see them. And he's also, I think he's an admin or a moderator on the Photoshop help group, so this guy knows his stuff when it comes to software as well. So have a look at his stuff. If you look at his profile actually and go to his website, it's quite an inspirational story behind him and a little bit about his life as well. Our recommended Flickr group this week will be the Creative Tabletop Photography Group at flickr.com/groups/creative_tabletop_photography/. Sort of inspired by my attempts at still life photography earlier in the week. When the weather's bad, when it's raining, you can't get outside. Do something inside with some lights and some objects, and if you go there, you'll see a huge range of things and subjects that people take pictures of. Some really cool shots, really quality images as well, really, really nice. And you think, oh yeah, excellent. Some really funny ones as well, so have a look at that. Well, that's it for our recommendations. Remember, we've still got our Flickr group with the time theme assignment going on. And one of the things I thought we could add to the group, which I'll probably add today, is I think we should do the themes, because I think they're brilliant. They get us out taking pictures of different subjects. But I also thought maybe we could add like a technique challenge as well. And the one I was thinking about was, when I say challenge, I mean it's an opportunity to practice and learn. And the one I was thinking about was the fact that, in the northern hemisphere now, the summer's in full flow, and often if you go out during the day, like I do to take photographs, because I've got to do it sort of between 10 and 2 while the kids are at school, the sun can be really bright in the sky, and unless it's overcast or really cloudy, it's hard to get nice landscape shots or outside shots in general, because you always end up with the sky looking bland and blown out, or that you can get the sky looking nice but the ground looks too dark. And I know I can get around it by taking HDRs, but I'm not sick of HDRs, but I'm aware that I'm using them a lot, and I'd like to use less because I want to have some more natural looking pictures. And so the technique I thought we could maybe practice for the next few weeks would be landscapes without any sky in. So no sky landscapes. And when I say landscape, it doesn't have to be the countryside. It can be an urban landscape, it could be the countryside, it could be a seascape, it could be anything, but shots with no sky in them. So you're either panning down, or you're taking pictures from up high looking down, or you're getting low down on the ground, something like that. And I thought it might be quite interesting, so I'll put that up on the group. So no sky landscapes as a technique challenge, which isn't to replace the time theme or the time assignment. It's an addition to it. It's something else to think about when you're going out shooting. Okay, well that's it for today. Any questions or comments or suggestions for things we want me to cover on the podcast or the blog, you can email me at scalespeeder@gmail.com. You can contact me on the website. There's loads of contact forms there. You can contact me on the Flickr group. Please go along and join the Flickr group and get involved in the discussion. I'd like to thank Everyday Jones again, their song Here I Am, which was the intro and the outro music, and you can find their stuff at podsafeaudio.com. I'd like to thank everybody for commenting on the site, really, really good, commenting on my pictures, taking part in the forum. It's really good to see it start to come together, and hopefully people are getting something out of it, because that's what it's all about. It's all about enjoying photography, and the next time you're out, you're thinking, oh yeah, I wonder if I'll try this, and it sort of inspires you to try something different, so you're learning. And finally, thank you for downloading and listening to the podcast. I appreciate it very, very much. Actually, there's one thing you could do for me. If you enjoy the podcast and you think, oh yeah, that's a good listen, and you subscribe on iTunes, please go to iTunes, find the podcast, just look for SCL podcast, photography, something like that, subject, composition and light, and write a little review. Just say, well, if you don't like it, say you don't like it, but write a little review on there, because it really helps bump up the podcast through the rankings, so that we can get more listeners and more participants in the group and everything like that. So thank you again for listening, and I'll be seeing you on Flickr.